Hi there, Bob. Welcome to the Guitar Show. What are we doing today?
Hi there, Ramon. Ramon's going to come on camera in vision with me in a minute, but first we're going to do some unboxing, which I know you guys out there really like. If you look at the floor below my feet now, you'll see we've got two brown Gibson 50s California Gold cases. Wonder what we've got inside today. Well, one of them you'll be familiar with because you've seen this on previous videos. This is my 58 Les Paul Standard Sunburst. I'll get on to describing it when it's out of the box. But that's one of the things we're going to be looking at today. But even more special, perhaps, is its next door neighbour. I've just noticed the marquee sticker here, so this guitar obviously has got a gigging history. Similar case, and what have we got inside? Wow. This is a very early 1960 Les Paul Standard Sunburst. Belongs to a good friend of mine who I might give a name check to a bit later. It's in fabulous condition. Again, once we get it out of the box, I'll talk about it, show it, and in particular I'll be highlighting on some of the similarities and differences between the two guitars, because every one of these guitars is unique, and that's certainly the case for these two. So, right.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi guys, Ramon and Bob here for another edition of the Guitar Show. Bit of a treat for you today. We have not one, but two late 50s Gibson Les Paul Sunbursts. Ramon is playing mine, it's a 58, and I'm playing this one, which belongs to my friend Steve Jackson, and this is a 1960. But what I want to talk about today briefly is the similarities and differences between these two guitars. Each was effectively almost handmade back in the late 50s by the craftsmen at Gibson. Remember, Gibson were very much a craftsman-led company, so although Fender were making slab-bodied bolt-on guitars by then and really threatening Gibson's market share, Gibson were very much sticking to their last, literally, and making craftsman guitars, which is one of the reasons why these guitars have got celloed chamfered tops, which are all done by hand. Anyway, suffice to say, the 58, classically, the 58s have got the biggest, thickest necks. It's a C profile. The C flattened slightly to a D profile in 1959 and then became much skinnier in 1960. Talking about these guitars, similarities and differences, let's start with the neck. The 58, classically, quite a wide, deep, C-shaped neck. By 59, the neck had flattened slightly to more of a D profile, and then in 1960 the necks became much skinnier. The other significant thing that happened in 1960 was that they changed the colour of the red dye of the Sunburst. So this guitar was once bright red going into bright yellow, so was this. As you can see, neither of these has got much red on it at all. That's got a bit of red that's turned to brown, it's yellow in the middle. This has gone completely, that's what they call a T-burst. This is what they call a lemon burst or lemon drop. In mid-1960 they changed the red dye so it became stable in sunlight, and so you'll see 60s Les Pauls that are typically much redder and yellower. The other thing, of course, is the wood. This is a pretty typical early-ish 58. By the way, on the back, the mahogany on these started out quite cherry red, and you can see mine's kind of cherry barley sugar, and this one's almost completely mellowed to brown now. But talking about the wood on the top, in 58, many of the tops were plain. The striping you're seeing here is called medullary grain. The plain burst 58 is a favourite of Mark Knopfler. That's what he prefers.
And this is really quite a plain top.
It's quite a plain top, and I prefer it because it's mine. But in all seriousness, when you look at this stuff, the stuff that's going on in this top is just amazing.
Yeah.
You should be able to see.
It's a real 3D quality, isn't it?
Absolutely 3D. You've got really great flame going on in here. Interestingly, you've also got a little bit of medullary grain going on here. But this is classic, much more typical of the 1959 and onwards Les Paul.
Were they choosing, particular grains around that time? Were they seeking out these beautiful tops?
They more and more they were trying to, because this was a fancy guitar. It's a premium guitar.
Right.
But there are examples of very early ones, earlier than that, where it isn't two pieces book matched across the top. It's actually sometimes three pieces with an asymmetrical seam. There's a few examples like that. And this one, for example, is very flamey, but it's not well book matched. The figure does not book match identically, but it's a centre seam, as is that one. Right, now, the final thing to say is to qualify this guitar. This guitar has a 1960 serial number. It's 002XX. You never give all the numbers away because that's how the fakers then clone your guitar. And there are many, many fakers in the world. The old joke about these guitars is that there were only so many of these guitars made, of which more than 4 times as many survive. That's the joke about fakes. But this guitar is a 1960, but it's a very early 1960, and to all intents and purposes, and I've played quite a lot of these things, this is a 1959 guitar. It's got...
So it's that transitional year, because it wasn't on Christmas Day, they changed the neck shape.
They didn't change the neck shape. They did change the die in one batch, but so that was later in the year.
That was maybe, what month would that have been?
I'm guessing kind of April. There's an expert out there somewhere who can tell us, but somewhere around there.
So this would have been like January, February?
This is probably January, February, and it's got a really big neck, not much smaller than that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So actually, even for a 59, this is quite a chunky neck. Nothing like a 60 neck at all. It's obviously got the fade of a 58 or a 59. So to all intents and purposes, it's a 1959 guitar. The other most important difference about these guitars as they changed was in 58, the frets are still the 50s Gibson frets, and they're quite narrow, tall and thin, and they're a little harder to play. By the time you get to early mid-59, they've put the Gibson frets that you would probably be much more familiar with, wider and flatter, and as a consequence, the changing the frets alone changes the sustain on the instrument. So the old Spinal Tap joke about, can you hear the sustain? I can't hear anything, just listen to the sustain. This guitar, it's a Les Paul Sunburst, it sustains beautifully. This guitar, because it's got the later frets, even better, even better. So, you might have seen it, I said in the last video, the price hierarchy of these guitars is top of the tree, platinum prize, 59s, lots of flame, big fat necks, fantastic pickups, big frets. That's the top of the tree. Next come 58s, because they've got all the sound contributing characteristics, lovely big neck for the tone, but they've got the downside of the small frets. And third prize goes to the 60s. 60s lose a bit of tone because of their thinner necks. Sorry if I'm offending, and there will be people out there who disagree, but every 60 I've played has been loud, but it's lacked a little of the...
Yeah, because the neck mass can make up a big portion of the sound.
Certainly my experience of these guitars and of early Strats and Tellys is that a lot of the sound
comes from the neck.
A lot of the sound.
Should we go through the pickups on this guitar? If I play you a little sort of Peter Green-esque C minor groove.
Okay.
And then just try that, yeah?
Yeah. So, neck pickup. to go to the bridge. Let's try both together.
Okay, let me just go through. So I'm going to go through the bridge first. Okay, let's try both together. The neck. So they've got different voices, haven't they? But they're in the same kind of tonal ballpark.
I would say I've had the pleasure of playing this guitar before. I did a setup on it a few years ago. This guitar is slightly more powerful, slightly louder, slightly noisier, a bit more butch. This is quite recessive isn't the right word. It has a gentler voice, which I've owned it a long time, so I've got really used to it, and I love playing it. When I play a guitar like this, I have to pull back a little bit from it because otherwise I find I'm just shouting.
Right.
A bit like when you play a really good old Junior and you suddenly find you're like shouting and screaming. And so you need to rein back a bit more. But it plays fantastic, and as I say, it's about as good an example of this kind of guitar as you could find. Okay, so a couple of other bits of detail for those of you out there. The top carve, the curve of the violining, if you like, on top of guitars. On each Les Paul, if you really want to get geeky about it and get the measurements out, they're different. You can notice this particularly on earlier 50s gold tops, where just by looking at them, hold them up to them, just let the light play across the curves, and you can see some of the guitars are almost pancake flat. Some of them are very flat around the edges. My 54 gold top is really flat around the edges. Some have really quite a pronounced rise in the middle. Again, this is because these were effectively, although they were produced on a bench, they are production guitars, they were each produced by hand. All the necks were shaped by a guy on a belt sander, taking a stick of wood and shaping it. Obviously they had an objective of the kind of shape they wanted to feel, and being skilled craftsmen, they could feel it with their hand, but nevertheless they all differ. Some of them aren't quite symmetrical, some are completely symmetrical. Both of these are symmetrical. So there's that. Another little geek detail for you, if you like it, is there's probably 18 months between these pickups, and the way these pickups were stamped, the covers, the metal covers, nickel covers, were actually they're steel covers, plated in nickel. They were stamped onto a very hard iron form, and as that form was used and the stamp was pressed over them again and again, the corners of that form gradually smoothed. So what you find is that pickups on 58s, 57s and 58 PAFs are really flat with quite square corners. They're still rounded but squarer, and as the pickups get later they get ever so slightly rounder and more like the kind of pickup covers that you would now expect to see on a typical Gibson humbucking pickup.
So coming back to the actual tone, Bob, I mean, this has kind of been said a lot of times before, but there is definitely some kind of magic. It's a Queen song. There's some kind of magic in the sound of these instruments, because you hear all the replicas, you hear there's some great boutique guys making these pickup replicas, but there's still something here that's a bit more magical. From this guitar and this guitar, I'm not hearing it in a modern Gibson custom shop. I'm not hearing it in these modern boutique pickups. So what's going on there?
No,
Why is that?
you can get close. Well, I mean, books have been written on this, mainly in Japanese, so I can't read them, but books have been written on this. And the explanation that seems to have come about is that, these guitars are now, so 58, so what's that, a 60-year-old guitar?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these guitars are both plus or minus 60 years old, and in that time they've been exposed to we don't know what before. I mean, these have both been in their current ownership for around about 20 and a bit years. But before that, who knows what happened to these guitars? And were they stored anywhere near a television with a tube that was going off, or fluorescent lights, or anything that was inductive, or did the magnets just gradually lose their power over time?
Mellow out.
Yeah, and most vintage guitars, the best vintage guitars, do not have very high DC resistances, very high impedances, and all the rest of it. And most pickup makers, for example, if you look at Strat pickups, British maker Mark Foley, whose pickups are now being used by an awful lot of hot Strat players around the world.
And my man Mojo.
And your man Mojo.
Mark from Mojo Pickups.
They're both, those guys seem to be spending a lot less time looking at DC resistance now, and a lot more about things like inductance and capacitance. That seems to be a key. And these old guitar pickups, these pickups are hotter than the Strat pickups of the same year, but they're both half the hotness of a modern hot pickup.
But they give the impression that they're hot.
They're full of tone, they've got air inside the sound, plenty of space.
A lot of air, yeah.
And of course the thing is, especially even back in the day, this guitar was really not special until some bloke decided to put it through an overdriven amp. And that bloke was called Eric Clapton. He put it through an overdriven Marshall, and the rest is history. And the magic of these guitars, that actually, whatever their beautiful innate sound, what you really have to do is just crash it to bits to get the absolute magic. And of course nowadays, we're lucky, we guitar players are lucky, we've got, really easy access to incredible amplification.
I mean, this is another thing about it being a vintage guitar, because you've got to remember back in '66 when Eric Clapton cut the Bluesbreaker album, the guitar was actually only 7 years old, right? 7 years old?
Yeah, about right, yeah.
So it wasn't a vintage guitar, it was a new, all intents and purposes.
It was a pre-owned guitar.
Yeah, it was a pre-owned. Yeah. So I think they've always had a magic, even right from the get-go. They've had something special about them.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting because there were two really different tones coming out of two different countries at that point, right? If you just think about Eric Clapton and Mike Bloomfield, great example. They both ended up playing, well, at the height of those powers, the period we're talking about, they both played Sunbursts. Bloomfield famously often played through a Fender Super. And
What a piercing tone, wasn't it?
And I had that guitar through a Fender Super at my place just a couple of days ago. And it, apart from the small lack of talent, it was Mike Bloomfield in the room. Sharp, really quite sharp, especially on the treble pickup. And that beautiful, in the middle pickup, that beautiful reedy, glinty sound. Typical Bloomfield, brilliant. But the Clapton tone, completely different, okay? These are quite dark guitars, certainly compared to a Fender. So Clapton's tone was all about taking a Marshall and diming it. Just ran his hand across the controls, all the controls on full, which meant the guitar has a lot of middle and a lot of high middle and treble, which with a Telecaster would probably just take your eardrums out. But with one of these, which is a darker guitar, that's where that magical drive and sustain came from. And most of the late 60s, early 70s prog players were playing a Les Paul through a Marshall or a Hi-Watt or something.
It was a guaranteed tone that you could get out of that instrument.
But remember, this is also a time when people weren't putting their guitars through the PA, so they were using 100, 200, 300 watt stacks, multiple 4x12 cabinets on stage.
I think you can see it best when if you watch the live. There's a really cool live concert of Free, and Paul Kossoff just diming his Marshall stack, and you can just hear that classic British sort of Les Paul tone.
Absolutely, great example. And these guys all used to play loud. I mean, for the ones who haven't already left us, sadly, you meet most of them today, and their hearing isn't great, because night after night going out under that, I mean, you just mash your hearing. But that's how that sound was created. The Clapton sound is actually only what was the Bluesbreaker amp? Was it 22 or 35 watts? Combo.
I think it's 30 watts, 35
right,
watts.
but I mean, the stories in the books. I mean, the engineers in the Decca recording studios, all in their brown technicians' overcoats, they'd never heard anything like it. Turn that thing down, young man. Nope, that's my sound.
Yeah.
You know, it was a revolution.
The whole band were sort of geared to that sound.
And you know, the reason these guitars are so loved and so revered is yes, they're old and they're valuable and they're lovely, but mainly because these are the guitars that were or are played by most of everybody's heroes from that day in the prime. You know, whether you're talking to Wayne Allman, you're talking about my favourite, Gary Green from Gentle Giant, you're talking about Clapton.
Who's he?
Who's he? He's a prog guy.
Not Clapton, the other guy.
Actually, he's a great blues player in a prog band. But
you know, I mean, what I love about these instruments is you can kind of go. You know, you've got that classic English sort of. Got that, you know, that classic sound in, you know, the Peter Green.
Mutilated that nicely, right? Yeah, you're right. They do. I mean, we're obviously playing through small amps here and at really low volume, you know, talking volume. And so, if you were doing that for real, you'd get that same kind of sound as you got just then, but you'd have quite a lot more bass underneath. And when you get that bass coming through as well, these guitars have got plenty of bass, and the way they drive their bass is again so warm and sweet.
Yeah.
And now you're beginning to edge towards the sound. But you know, the reason these guitars are so valuable is because these are the guitars of choice for some of the greatest guitar music ever created.
So shall we end on? Could we do a swap? Can we end on a classic Clapton song?
Thank you. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thank you.